They told me to let him die. He was just another body among many. But that night, when the wind blew through the ship's planks and the engine groaned louder than usual, he murmured a song, and it wasn't just any melody. It was the lullaby my mother sang, softly, just for me, only when the world outside seemed too dangerous. Time has these things. Sometimes it doesn't return with dates, nor with facts. It returns with sounds, with smells, with things that escape control and lodge themselves in a corner of the heart where no war has ever touched. On that evacuation ship, with bodies being hastily transferred and names crossed off lists before we even knew their faces, I heard that song, coming from the half-open mouth of an unconscious man, and everything inside me trembled, because no one else knew about it. No one. By then it had been over 30 years since my mother had passed away, and yet her memory seemed more vivid to me than the man stretched out on the stretcher. He was bleeding, yes, but he bled slowly, as if time itself hesitated to take him. And me? I hesitated too, because between obeying and feeling, I chose to feel. I chose to hide. I chose to care for those who weren't on the list. And that's when everything changed. My name is Corinne Estella Brooks. I'm 90 years old now. I live alone in a log cabin high in the West Virginia mountains, where silence comes before the snow. The roof creaks in the wind, the windows fog with the morning mist. And here I am, among hand-labeled glass jars, herbal books, and memories uncertain whether they're real or just remnants of dreams. My hair has turned silver and rests in dreadlocks piled high on my head, the way my grandmother did when mourning was still a novelty. My dark green raincoat still protects me when I go out, but it doesn't protect me from what lives inside. That wounded man, the one who shouldn't be there. He came back to me in the form of music, and he never left me again. Sit here with me, my flower. Pull this blanket over your lap, because today the cold doesn't just come from outside. It comes from a time that froze inside me. I'm going to tell you a story that never fit into the reports, that had no stamp or date. But that never left my heart, and if you feel that some memories only live when they're told, then subscribe to the channel. This is a safe place. We don't judge the past. We hold its hand. It was 1956, and the air on the ship's deck was heavier than the smoke from distant explosions. The water of the Suez Canal reflected the gray-stained sky, and the sound of helicopters crossing overhead seemed to tear time in two. I was part of the nursing team receiving the evacuees, wounded, shell-shocked soldiers, silent children, all of them passing us by with empty eyes and bodies crying out for help. And everything was fast. Everything was a line. Everything was a name crossed out or scribbled on clipboards. That day the chaos seemed to have doubled in magnitude. There was a scuffle on the loading bridge, someone shouting in Arabic, another responding in French. The smell of raw gasoline and old blood permeated our clothes, and our boots slapped loudly against the ship's wet metal. I was holding a catheter with one hand and pushing an empty stretcher with the other when I saw him, lying on the floor, half covered by a dirty military blanket, his hands bandaged by some crude, improvised means, and a throbbing open wound on the right side of his chest. No one spoke to him. No one asked who he was. A young lieutenant walked by, saw the man, and simply said, as if reading a pill insert, "Not on the list. Ignore. Priority 2. Priority 2 meant something I learned to hate. It was a uniform euphemism for let it die if necessary. And I'd heard that sentence many times, but never as clearly as in that moment. His face was covered in soot, his lips cracked, and yet there was a strange serenity in his features. It wasn't despair. It was as if he were waiting. I looked around. The other wounded were being carried away, screaming, raving, some grabbing my wrist and begging for morphine. But he, that forgotten, invisible, anonymous man, wasn't asking for anything. He just looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that paralyzed me. An ancient weariness, an ancient silence, as if he'd come from long before the war. So I crouched beside him, felt the heat of fever seeping from his skin, and whispered, almost unconsciously, "Where's your name?" He didn't answer. He just moved his head to the side and closed his eyes. And there, in that simple gesture, I sensed there was something that couldn't be left to die. Something that had nothing to do with orders or hierarchy. I stood up with an impulse only the body understands, without thinking, and pulled the empty stretcher closer to him. I threw the blanket over it, covered my face with a damp cloth, and tucked someone else's clipboard under the metal frame, as a disguise. I carried him alone to the back of the mobile infirmary, where the boxes of supplies and the stocks of gauze were kept. It was a makeshift hiding place, a space that held little more than his body and my decision. In that instant I knew. There was no name, no record, no permit. But there was a wounded man. And my heart, even hardened, still knew how to recognize a survivor. And what I didn't know, what I never imagined, is that this man carried something that was mine, even without knowing me. Something that was kept inside him like a reliquary that would only be opened at the right moment. But until then, I would hide it. And with him, I would also hide a piece of myself. The supply bay was at the back of the infirmary, behind a loosely hinged steel door that smelled of wet rust. No one spent much time there. It was dark, cramped, and filled with poorly labeled boxes, bandages, morphine, cans of food, sterile syringes still wrapped in thin string. It was the kind of place where the silence always felt suspicious. As I pushed the stretcher in, the front wheel caught on a bump in the ground. I had to pull it out hard, and the impact shook his body. A low groan escaped his cracked lips, and then, like a whisper from my own childhood, he muttered something I could barely hear. It wasn't a word. It was the beginning of a melody. In that instant, everything inside me split in two. Part of me wanted to run and call someone, report it, rid myself of this burden. The other part, the one that couldn't be explained logically, stood still. My fingers tingled. My vision felt blurry with unborn tears. It was as if my mother's voice was trying to get through that man's throat. But he passed out again, and the silence returned. I gritted my teeth and began to set up my hiding place. I gathered boxes around the stretcher, covered it with stained tarps, and left an open bottle of ether nearby as an excuse for any unusual smells. The heat inside the space was stifling, and sweat dripped down the inside of my raincoat as if I'd plunged into a lake of guilt. The ship's rules were clear. No civilian or unidentified combatant could remain on board without registration, especially a wounded person, especially an unknown person. Every hour an officer would come and check inventories, and if they found out, well, there were silent punishments too. Removals, disappearances, being told you'd lost your mind and been sent back. I'd seen it happen, to women much stronger than me. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was keeping him alive until the next port. That was all. I had no plan. I didn't know who he was. But I knew that if I left him behind, something inside me would die too. That night I returned to the compartment with a wet towel and a canteen of water. His fever was rising. His hands trembled under the blanket. I touched his forehead and whispered, like my mother used to do to me when I had nightmares. "Just breathe, okay? Just breathe." And for a moment, just a moment, he responded with an involuntary gesture, moving his head as if recognizing that voice deep in his sleep. I sat on the floor beside the stretcher. I stayed there, listening to the sounds of the ship, the hurried footsteps, the muffled screams from the infirmary, and I realized I was praying. Not a request to God, but a promise to silence. I promised I would protect that man, not because of who he was, but because of what, in some inexplicable way, he reminded me of. A forgotten piece of myself, or of someone I loved and lost. And so my secret began. A wounded man hidden among the boxes, breathing slowly, lulled by a song I still didn't have the courage to fully recognize. And when the next day arrived and the first names were called for screening, I lied, for the first time, with a clear heart, and the complicit silence of the metal walls seemed to protect me too. For the first 3 days I barely slept. The ship rocked slowly, as if hesitant to cross the channel, and every metallic clang made my stomach churn. I'd wake before the watch, grab a basin of clean gauze, and walk slowly to the hold, as if I were going to fetch morphine or check supplies. The smell inside oscillated between ether and fear. The wounded man was in a cold sweat. His breathing was irregular, sometimes ragged, sometimes so light I thought he'd passed away. He changed the sheets carefully, wrapped the stained ones in extra cloths, and placed them next to the discarded rags. He tucked each blood-stained piece under layers of white lies, and he never left the empty vials lying around. He reused the labels, falsified dates, and claimed they'd been used on soldiers who couldn't even remember my name. The younger nurses didn't ask questions. They thought I was too old to be questioned. The silent hierarchy of women on that ship was made of quick glances and unspoken pacts. The supply officer even asked why I was wasting so much compresses on soldiers with minor wounds. She said I should save money. I smiled and replied, "It's just that some bleed inside, Lieutenant. It just takes longer to show." She didn't argue. There was something in me that broke with each lie. Yes, but also something that strengthened, as if my hand, touching his wound, reminded me once again of what it means to protect without expecting anything in return. Each day hiding that body was a vote of faith in the inexplicable. I had no proof, no clues, only that song he'd whispered before, and which now seemed to repeat itself like a distant echo each time the fever rose. I'd catch myself humming silently, without realizing it. I'd only notice when I was near the end of the chorus and my hands were shaking. It was the lullaby, that one. The one my mother sang as she rocked me in her arms, her eyes tired and her mouth smelling of mint. The one no one else knew. I began to take a closer look at the wounded man. The marks on his body, the old scars. There were signs of a hard life, but also something familiar in the line of his jaw, the shape of his fingers, the way he frowned even when unconscious. A strange jolt would pierce my chest every now and then, as if I were trying to recall a face I had seen in a dream many years ago, but now fleshed out there, before me. At night I would sometimes sit beside him and just listen. His breathing, his moans, the sound of my own heart, trying to understand what was doing there. I didn't know if it was madness, delayed grief, or some childhood wound that never healed. But I knew there was something more there. And his silence spoke to me in a way no one else did. I made up names for him in my head. Jonas, Thomas, Isaiah. None of them fit. It felt like he already had a name engraved in me, but one I didn't dare pronounce yet. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe naming it would make him more real, more dangerous, closer to destroying everything I thought I knew about myself. And yet, every day I returned, even knowing that each visit, each hidden sheet, each silent word was a new line in the invisible diary I keep to this day. A diary made of silence, of care, and of questions never asked aloud. I awoke that morning to a dull thud, as if something had fallen on the upper deck. I looked out the quarters window. Only fog and the distant sound of ropes swaying in the wind. But inside me, there was another kind of noise, a muffled call, a chill that came from deep within my skin. I pulled on my raincoat, hurriedly laced my boots, and walked to the compartment, my heart clenching as if something were about to snap. When I opened the metal door, his eyes were open. Not wide-eyed, not panicked, just open, quiet, watching, as if they'd already known I was coming, as if they'd seen me before. Not there, not on that ship, but in another time, another place. My first impulse was to back away. For a second, I thought he was going to scream, to denounce me, to ask where I was, who I was. But he said nothing. I stood still, a compress still in my hand, feeling my own body freeze in the crack between fear and awe. And then he blinked slowly, a blink that wasn't just physical. It was like confirming a presence, like saying without words, "You're back." I knelt beside him, placed my hand on his arm and whispered, "Can you speak?" He moved his mouth, but no voice came. Just a whisper. His throat was still dry, his muscles weak. But his gaze pierced through. It was a gaze that asked silent questions. And perhaps the worst of them was, "Do you recognize me?" I took the canteen and carefully brought it to his lips. He drank silently, his eyes never leaving mine. Then I tried again. "What is your name?" "Nothing." He just took a deep breath, looked away for a moment, and then looked back at me. It was as if there was an agreement there, an unsigned pact. He wouldn't say who he was, and I wouldn't ask again. It was as if somehow this protected him, as if naming it would break a spell or reveal a truth neither of us was ready to bear. For the next few days he remained silent. He accepted the water, the thin soup I'd sneak him, the cold compresses that eased his fever, but he never said a word. Sometimes he'd just close his eyes and murmur softly, almost imperceptible sounds. And I knew it was her. The song. Always her. I began to wonder if I was going crazy, if that melody was all in my head. But then one morning between dressings, he stared at the pendant around my neck, an antique reliquary with a photograph of my mother as a young girl, and his eyes welled up. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't touch it. He just stared, as if rediscovering a lost symbol. And for an instant, the silence between us became presence. A dense, living presence that couldn't be put into words. As if he too carried that face within himself, but couldn't explain why. It was at that moment that I realized war wasn't just about bullets and maps. It also took place in the folds of the invisible, in the spaces between two memories that should never have crossed paths, but had. And he, the wounded man not on the list, was more than a survivor. He was a mirror of something I had buried so deep I no longer knew how to look. And there, among the glass vials and boxes of morphine, I knew that man was no stranger, not to me, even if he never said who he was. Night descended like a heavy veil over the ship. The desert wind seemed to tear at the sides of the vessel, and the emergency lights flickered orange, leaving everything smelling of doom. I lay in my hammock, wrapped in the rough blanket we used to brave the early morning chill. But sleep wouldn't come. There was something, a restlessness in the air, an anguish that wasn't new. But that night, I felt like I'd woken thirsty. I got up quietly. I walked through the now empty corridors of the infirmary, avoiding the eyes of those sleeping rough in the hanging hammocks, and reached my compartment. The doorknob was cold, and as I turned it, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if time itself was warning me. Something's going to change now. I went in, and that's when I heard it. Weak, broken, as if coming from within a dream. He sang. They weren't whole words. It was more breath than sound. But the rhythm I knew. Every pause, every inflection. It was the lullaby of my childhood. The one my mother sang just for me. The one she never taught to anyone else. The one that disappeared with her, in the hospital, in the early hours of the morning when I was still a girl with short braids and scraped knees. Sleep, my star. Outside there is no more sound. The melody came like that, in fragments, but clear as the sound of my own name. I approached the stretcher, breathless, and saw his lips move slowly. His eyes were closed, his face damp with sweat. His bandaged hand trembled slightly, as if holding a memory. And then he repeated, "Time will pass, but I stay here, like you." My vision blurred. Tears fell without warning, without ceremony. They fell the way only the invisible truth can. I knelt. I held her hand in mine, and I cried, like a child lost in a dark room, like someone who finds a mother in the body of a stranger, because there was no explanation, there was no logic. But that song, only my mother knew. I lay there for hours, saying nothing, my face pressed against the stained blanket, listening to his breathing. Calm. He fell asleep again, and I didn't. I couldn't. I stayed awake until sunrise, trying to remember every line of that song, and the exact moment it had faded from my life. It was as if he had rescued something I hadn't even known I'd lost. The next morning my eyes were red, and my voice was hushed. The triage officer asked if I was sick. I smiled and said it was just an allergy. But inside something had changed. As if the world around me was still a war. But inside me, someone had lit a candle. And there, in the silence of that hidden compartment, the question that never left me was born. How did he know? How did he know how to sing what only my mother could sing? I spent the next 2 days walking as if on glass. Everything around me seemed untouched. The crash of the waves against the hull, the creak of the deck, the muffled screams of soldiers with high fevers. But inside me, something was in ruins. It wasn't just surprise. It was an ancient pain. The kind that has no name, only form. And its form was a song. That melody, he whispered. The way it came out, drawn out, broken, full of sighs between verses, wasn't just any song. It was the music of our house, but only when night fell, and my mother thought no one was listening. It was a song that didn't exist on the radio, in notebooks, in church hymns, only on her lips, and only for me. My mother didn't sing to distract herself. She sang like someone sewing, like someone holding together the cracks in the world with thread and voice. It was always after bad news, after my father's telegram arrived, saying he wouldn't be returning from the war. After we had to leave our rented house and live with a bitter aunt who spoke little and commanded a lot. In those moments when the world forgot us, she would take me in her lap, run her fingers slowly over my scalp, and whisper, "Sleep, my star. Outside there is no more sound." And it was only then that I felt that there was still a safe place, that there was still ground beneath my feet. But my mother left me early, too early, suddenly and abruptly, like everything back then. Pneumonia that led to hospitalization, a letter that arrived too late, and I, still a girl, was sent away. First to a foster family, then to a convent school, then to life. And with her, the music disappeared. I never heard it again. I never sang it again. Until now. So ask me, how can I bear it? How can I bear to hear from the mouth of a wounded stranger a song that was only yours, only hers? only from those nights of muffled crying and whispered promises. I couldn't stand it. The next morning between appointments, my hands began to shake. I dropped a tray of sterilized tweezers. I tried to laugh. I hid it. But the truth ate at me. At lunchtime, I went to the back of the ward, among the supplies, closed the door from the inside, knelt beside him, and collapsed. I cried with my face buried in my hands. I cried without grace, without control, without reserve. Like I hadn't cried in decades. Those tears weren't just for him. They were for me. For the girl who lost her mother too soon. For the woman who swore she was too strong. For the nurse who became a healing machine without time to feel. And above all, I cried for something that can't be explained. How did he know about the song? How? He was awake, weak, but awake. He looked at me, and for a moment, I think he knew. Not with words, but with that look that seemed to pierce layers of time. I squeezed his hand tightly, and for the first time I said something I'd never said out loud before. I just wanted to hear that song again, one last time. And you brought it back. He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes. But there, in that silence, I felt the war was still happening, but not out there. It was happening between us, and the battlefield was memory. After that dawn when he sang, nothing in me remained the same. Each day revolved around that narrow, stuffy room where lay the body of the man I didn't know, but who, in some impossible way, sang the most intimate memory of my childhood. The war raged on outside. Noisy, hurried, impersonal. But here inside, in the space we shared without words, it was different. A war made of unspoken questions, of restrained gestures, of an affection that was not admitted. I began caring for him, as I had never cared for any other patient in my life. It wasn't just technique. It was a kind of care that went beyond protocol. I began washing his hands more carefully. I warmed compresses between my own before touching him. I massaged his shoulder, stiff from long hours of immobility, even when he didn't ask. I began sewing small pieces of cloth to line his makeshift pillow. And I even saved a scented soap I'd received months before, just to leave it scent there, around him, as if it could heal him from the inside out. But all this, without asking anything. I didn't dare. I couldn't. Asking meant opening a door that might never close again. It meant shining too much light on a shadow that was precious to me. So I did the opposite. I immersed myself in care. I became an expert on the subtlest signs, the slight movement of his eyebrow when he was in pain, the tremor in his jaw when the cold reached him, before I changed the blanket, the way his eyes moved beneath his eyelids during dreams, and above all, the exact moment he began to sing, always when the fever returned, always the same way, softly, between sighs, with a voice that wasn't his, but mine. I jotted down excerpts of the song on a piece of paper, hidden in my lab coat pocket. I read and reread them. I compared them with what I remembered from childhood. There were verses that matched perfectly. There were others that seemed reconstructed, as if he'd invented them. But the chorus, that was intact. It was as if my mother's voice had survived it all, and now it was trapped inside a stranger. I began to notice the details of his face, too. The jawline, the outline of his ears, the blemishes on his skin. Every feature seemed to carry echoes of someone. But who? It wasn't my father. It wasn't an uncle. It wasn't anyone from my childhood that I could remember. And yet, I felt like he knew me. Sometimes I caught myself imagining he was reincarnated. Other times I thought it was just a delusion. Maybe my mind was making it all up to protect me from the pain. But then he would smile, or murmur, star. that specific word. And it all came back. Everything inside me would light up again. One afternoon, as I wiped his forehead with a damp cloth, he slowly opened his eyes. He didn't say anything, but he looked at me as if he knew I wasn't there just out of duty, as if he recognized something in me. And I smiled. A smile that offered no answers but asked permission. And in that moment I realized I no longer wanted to know who he was. I just wanted him to stay. That presence would remain there, between the supply boxes and the hidden sheets, cradling with its slow breathing what was most broken in me. And even without saying anything, he stayed. It was a muggy afternoon, just after a brief storm that only increased the smell of rust on the ship. I had carefully removed the bandages from his chest, replacing the stained gauze and redoing the stitches on the chest tube that were beginning to swell. He was breathing better now, more evenly. His face was still pale, but with a glow that didn't come from fever, but from something more vital, more present. I finished the dressing, straightened the sheet over his legs, and began folding the worn uniform shirt we'd removed days earlier. It was damp and stiff, like everything from war. It bore traces of blood, dust, and sand. But there was something strange about it. A weight in one of the inside pockets. Something small, round. I carefully reached in. And when I felt the metallic touch between my fingers, my heart skipped a beat. It was a button. Simple, darkened copper, with thin spiral grooves. The kind of button you don't find anymore. The kind you don't sell in stores. Not like that. Not with that specific design. I stood there staring at it in the palm of my hand. And the world stopped. Because I knew that button. It was the same, identical, as the ones in Themi Mother's old coat. A heavy navy blue coat she wore only in the winter, which enveloped me completely when I was little. I remember its texture, its smell, the sound it made when she bent down to hug me. And I remember the button. One had fallen off once, and she sewed it back on with brown thread, because that was what she had on hand. And the button never straightened out again. It was slightly askew, crooked, like this one. What I held now was equal. Even the crooked, even the line mark on the wrong side. My body froze. I sat on the floor, unsure if it was memory or hallucination. I looked at the sleeping man, at the button, at my hand, at the button again, and I gasped for air. I started doing the math in my head. Age, dates, impossibilities. But nothing added up, nothing made sense, and yet the button was there. Physical, cold, concrete. A memory that had crossed oceans to find me. I kept it inside the reliquary where my mother's photo was kept. Now there were 2 secrets inside, and I no longer knew which weighed more. That night I didn't go to sleep. I sat by his stretcher, watching him breathe, and every time he turned over as if in a deep sleep, the song returned to my ears, even if he wasn't singing. It was in him now, and in me too, mixed together. And the button seemed to tell me, "You didn't invent it, you remember?" It was then that I understood. Sometimes the past hides inside small objects, inside a melody, inside someone who appears nameless but brings with them everything that was forgotten. And at that moment I started to get scared. Because if that was true, what else could it be? The button never left my mind. In the days that followed, it seemed to burn in the reliquary around my neck, as if its presence whispered a truth my body couldn't yet accept. I found myself touching it with my fingers, lightly, as if confirming its texture could prepare me for what I already felt, but still didn't want to name. I saw him wake more often now. His eyes searched mine with less weight, less pain. The fever had subsided. His lips were no longer chapped, and sometimes they even cracked a tired smile. He never said anything, but there was something in his expression, an old kindness, as if he knew I had questions, and accepted that I didn't know how to ask them. One of those mornings, between changing the hidden sheets and changing the IV bottles, he looked at me differently. It wasn't the vacant look of someone offering silent thanks. It was the direct look of someone saying, "Ask away." And I almost asked. The name, the song, the button. What he knew. How he knew. Who he was. Where he came from. What he did with an object that could only have belonged to my mother. Like someone not on the list. I carried the most intimate part of my story. I opened my mouth. I felt the question rise in my throat. It hit the roof of my mouth like a wave about to break. But before the sound came out, I saw something in his eyes. It was fear. Yes, fear. Not for him, but for me. A gentle, resigned fear. As if he also knew that if that question were asked, everything would change. And maybe not for the better. So I swallowed the question. I turned my face away. I pretended to fiddle with the gauze. I did what so many women have learned to do when pain threatens to turn into revelation. I kept quiet. Because silence is sometimes the only way to keep something whole. To keep the truth from shattering what little ground remains. And even without saying anything, he understood. He closed his eyes slowly. And that night, he didn't sing. There was silence, a thick silence, almost ritualistic, and I felt, for the first time, that there was something between us that wasn't just memories, nor just hurt. It was a bridge, and on that bridge, no one ever crossed back unscathed. I went to sleep with the button pressed against my chest. And I swore to myself that I wouldn't ask anymore, because maybe certain answers are not to be heard. Perhaps what remains of us lives more safely within the unsaid. A surprise inspection of the ship and the tension of almost being discovered, and how he, even though weak, tried to protect her. The warning came late in the afternoon, when the sky was already curling into a copper hue. And the waves were pounding harder against the ship's hull. The metallic voice from the loudspeakers announced the emergency inspection like a sentence in the air. Dry, definitive, with no room for pleas. The movement began immediately. Boots hurried through the corridors, clipboards in fists, eyes trained to find what shouldn't be there. Inside me, time cracked. I ran to the supply closet with measured steps. My body was on autopilot, but my mind was already jumping to scenarios I couldn't bear. Every heartbeat was like a war drum, warning me that my secret was hanging by a thread. When I arrived, he was awake, half lucid, half surrendered to exhaustion. Even so, his eyes said he understood, that he already knew. That he was ready to disappear again. He moved his arm slowly, pointing with his eyes to the gap between food boxes and old tops. It was a tiny gesture, but full of intention. It was as if, even without strength, he was saying to me, "There will be time. Hide me." Helping him into the room was like moving a part of my own body. Every joint trembled. His weight seemed doubled, and yet I didn't hesitate. I tucked him into dark cloths, hid him under boxes and jars, and enveloped the silence with layers of urgency. The lid was closed carefully, as if I were burying something sacred. And when the door opened again, I was already standing, my hands clean, and my face impassive. The officers entered like ghosts. They rummaged, sniffed, opened drawers. Their eyes were cold, memoryless. They were searching for infractions, not people. One of them approached the boxes stacked on top of the hiding place and placed his hand there, firm, suspicious. The edge gave slightly under the weight. Inside, I felt like the whole world was collapsing in slow motion. It was as if everything I had protected with my heart was about to be ripped apart by a faceless clipboard. At that moment, a barely audible sound rent the air. A shift. A tiny crack. A sound that could have come from anywhere. But I knew where it was coming from. The tension rose. The breath caught in the throat. But something happened. One of the soldier's eyes shifted for a second. He hesitated, and the inspection continued, like a miracle, like a silent pact between fear and chance. When it was all over, and the footsteps receded down the hallway, I waited a moment longer before returning to him. My legs felt like wax. Cold sweat trickled down my temples. I approached the box, slowly peeling off my layers, and found him there, breathing deeply, exhausted but awake. His expression was different. There was no anguish. There was something gentle, almost serene. And there, in that moment, I understood. Even weak, even injured, even without knowing where he was, he had let himself hide not only out of survival instinct, but for me. He chose silence to protect me. And I was never the same after that. The nights took on a different weight after the inspection. The silence seemed thicker, as if something between us had solidified. Not an agreement made with words, but a bond forged in shared fear, in the risks we'd taken together, in the mutual protection that now surrounded us like a thick fog. I kept going to him as if walking inward. Each visit was a deeper dive. Over time, his eyes began to speak more. They weren't so dull anymore. They weren't just a reflection of pain or fever. There was a kind of memory there that couldn't be explained, a glow that grew each time he observed me in silence, as if, in watching me, he were trying to piece together an ancient puzzle whose pieces had never fit together. Until now. One night, as I was arranging some gauze and warming the cloth with herbs he seemed to tolerate best, I felt him watching me for a long time. Not with urgency, nor with fear, but with a kind of calm that only exists in those who recognize the inevitable. I turned slightly, and our eyes met. And in that instant, a vertigo swept through me. It wasn't desire, nor simple affection. It was as if he were watching me from a place I'd forgotten I existed. And then it came. In the middle of the night, amidst the sea's hiss against the hull and the creaking of the wood, I heard my name. Faint. Dragged. As if it were being spoken not by someone who had learned it, but by someone who had carried it forever. Corinne. But not said as others had. Not like the shipmates, nor the officers or doctors. There was a different tone, an older rhythm, a slight accent, but marked by a way of naming I hadn't heard since childhood, a way of speaking only my mother had, a longer sound at the end, an inexplicable sweetness in the R, an intonation that made everything inside me shatter into small pangs of longing. He said my name as if he had given it to me himself, as if it were his. Over the next few nights it repeated itself, always in the moments between sleep and fever, always softly, as if speaking to myself, and I listened with a heavy heart, pretending not to hear, pretending it could just be delirium, just some random sound pulled from the memory of another woman, from another place. But it wasn't. Because every time he said my name like that, pale, intimate, knowing, something inside me felt like I was 8 years old again. I was sitting on my mother's lap again, listening to the song, listening to her breath intertwine with mine. It was as if that voice knew me before I did. And that, more than any button, more than any song, left me speechless. Because names have power. And he said mine, like someone keeping a secret, like someone carrying a story that hasn't yet been told, like someone who, deep down, never forgot me. Over time, his body began to respond to the care. His most recent wounds slowly healed. His breathing was no longer so labored, and his gaze, that mysterious, tender, unfathomable gaze, became more present. I could see traces of youth still hidden beneath the weariness, as if each day he returned a little closer to the place where he had almost disappeared. It was during a more thorough dressing change, while I was cleaning the marks on his shoulders and the sides of his abdomen, that I noticed something strange. Not in the war wounds, but in others, older, much older. Faded, almost imperceptible scars that seemed to have inhabited his body long before the fresh blood. One, on his right shoulder, was crescent-shaped, like a poorly healed bite. Another on the left side of his ribs was long, thin, and slightly curved. It resembled a scratch on glass, and on his left knee, a shallow oval mark, like a burn from a pan or an iron. My fingers trembled. The air grew thicker inside the compartment, because I knew those marks. Not with my eyes, but with my body's memory, with the memory of childhood. There was a time lost in the folds of time when I shared the backyard with a boy. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He had no name. He appeared and disappeared like someone in a dream. He came when I was alone. He never came through the door, and my mother never mentioned him. But she also never seemed surprised when he was around. He taught me stone games, helped me climb the wall, pick flowers, and made crowns for my head. He was silent, but he smiled with his eyes, a wide smile of someone who knew things no child could. And he had scars. I remembered them well. One on his shoulder, another on his ribs, another on his knee. I remember because I'd ask where they came from, and he'd say, laughing, that they were maps. Maps of what he'd already been through. But over time, that boy disappeared, and everything about him was swallowed by a thick fog of my memory. I grew up believing he was a figment of my imagination, an imaginary friend created by grief, loneliness, and my father's absence. No one remembered him anymore. No one saw him. And one day, I stopped believing it too. Until now. Because there, in front of me, the man I was hiding, the wounded man who wasn't on the list, was carrying the same scars, in the same places, with the same formats. I felt my legs give way. I leaned against the corner of the wooden counter, trying to control my dizziness. His face remained calm, as if he were sleeping. But this wasn't just about war anymore. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about a connection that cut through layers I hadn't even known existed. Maybe he was just an ordinary man with similar markings. Maybe my tired mind was searching for connections where there were none. But maybe he was that boy, the one who disappeared, the one who knew the song, the one who said my name with an accent that only exists in memory. What if it was? What if he had come back, after all these years, carrying the scars that no one else saw, but that I never forgot? I couldn't sleep that night. The images of the scars, the name whispered in that ancient accent, the song that wouldn't leave him. Or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe he was the one who wouldn't leave the song. All of it swirled inside me like a spiral. It was like being surrounded by broken mirrors, where each reflection showed a piece of me I'd forgotten existed. When day broke, I excused myself from the infirmary. I said I needed to organize old papers and report lost materials. No one questioned me. I was no longer expected to be at the center of decision-making. At 90, my opinions were treated with respect, but without urgency. I returned to my dorm. I opened the old leather bag I always carried with me, not out of necessity, but out of attachment. It was all I had left from the years when my life was still organized in drawers, before everything became canvas boxes and commitments to other people's pain. There, between a folded sweater and a scarf that still carried the scent of camphor, it was my childhood diary. The notebook was small, with a faded blue cover and worn edges. Thin, yellowed pages filled with crude drawings, the scribbles of a child writing for no one. I had forgotten many of the pages. Words I no longer recognized as mine. Drawings of flowers. Made-up names. But then, almost at the end between two sheets glued together by time, I found it. Not a name. Not a face. But the lyrics of the song. It was there. Written in a shaky, childish handwriting, with spelling errors and poorly marked spaces. But unmistakable. The same melody. The same verses he whispered in fever. The same ones I kept in silence. They were there. Written by me. And above the letter was a faded name. A name I had tried to scratch out or perhaps hide. Only the first letter remained. A capital I. The rest had been covered by overlapping strokes, like someone trying to bury a memory with their own hand. The impact was blunt. I sat up in bed, the diary in my lap, and felt my eyes sting. I didn't cry like before. It was a different kind of pain now. It wasn't loss. It was recognition. It was the echo of something that had always been there, quiet, waiting for the right time to emerge. With my fingers, I traced the words as if they were a map. I touched each line, as if searching for a pulse in a dead letter, and it pulsed, alive, present, as if my past had finally found its way out of the darkness. That night, I returned to him early. I sat on the floor next to the stretcher and said nothing. I just rested the closed diary against my chest and closed my eyes. No need to show. Not even counting. Not even to prove. Because between us there was no longer any need for questions. Just the certainty that, even without knowing how, we both already belonged to each other before all this. The ship began to slow down 2 days later. The vibrations in the hull changed rhythm, the metallic sounds became more spaced out, and the crew walked with short steps, as if the end of the crossing heralded not only the return to dry land, but also the return of everything that had been forgotten along the way. There would be disembarkation in a few hours. The protocol required final reports, screenings, medical material reviews, and most importantly, the official count of each body on board. I knew what this meant. I knew that once the ship was inspected on land, no box would be left unopened. No compartment would escape the eyes of security. The hiding place would no longer be secure. And the question that had been haunting me for weeks whispered urgently again. What would I do with him? I spent the entire night sitting beside the stretcher, watching his calm breathing. He slept as if he already knew this was his last night. The sheet covered his body up to his chest, and the copper button I had kept in the reliquary seemed to burn against my skin with an ancient weight. There were no more doubts. But there was also no room for explanations. In the morning, I prepared a package. I rolled up some gauze, placed a canteen of clean water, a piece of bread, a vial of medicinal oil, and, among all this, a note. Handwritten, short, and unsigned. You gave me something no one else could give back. Go in peace. I folded the paper 3 times, like my mother did with prayers, and tucked it under his belly band, inside his shirt. When the ship docked, the sky was overcast. The sound of cranes echoed at regular intervals. I requested permission to leave early, citing health issues. The officer's eyes rested on me with that mixture of respect and disdain one accords to one's elders. No one refused. I returned to the compartment. He was awake. But he didn't try to speak. He didn't move. He just looked at me, as if he already knew this was the moment, as if he expected nothing more from me. No explanations, no promises, no forgiveness. I supported him slowly, helping him walk with what little strength he had left. His feet touched the ground as if each step were a farewell to what would no longer live. I led him to the side exit of the deck, where the tarps were thrown over the hospital waste. I carefully opened the trapdoor and motioned for him to follow the path between the containers. There, amidst shadows and noises, there was a chance to disappear, unseen, unlisted, untranslated into the bureaucracy of war. He looked at me one last time, and in that look, there was everything: recognition, gratitude, farewell, and silence. A silence heavier than any words. A silence filled with memories that would never be spoken. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood there, my chest tight, watching his silhouette walk away. He didn't look back, and that's how I let him go. No questions, no answers, with the same lack of explanations with which he had arrived. Some truths, I understood there, do not fit into reason. They are made of another material, of intertwined time, of losses that know no logic, of bonds that live outside the calendar. And letting him go was, at the same time, the cruelest and purest gesture I have ever made. Decades have passed since that day at the port. Life went on silently, the way only old age understands, made of slow steps, of identical days, of memories that settle in the corners of the house like ancient dust. I never saw that man again. I never heard his name again. I never discovered if he was a survivor like so many others, or someone who existed only to restore the part of myself I had lost. I returned to America with my small suitcase, my reliquary clutched to my chest, and an absence that followed me like a shadow. I worked in clinics, served in forgotten villages, and gradually withdrew from the world, as if the only place where I truly existed had remained there, in that stuffy compartment between boxes and unspoken promises. And yet, I never told anyone. Not my classmates, not my sisters at church, not even my family, when I still spoke to them. I kept that story to myself as if it weren't made of facts, but of a spell too delicate to be exposed to the light of day. Until the morning I found the package. It was early fall. The leaves still danced on the porch of my West Virginia cabin, and the fog hung over the pines like an old familiar blanket. I went out to collect firewood, as I do every Saturday, and there it was, wrapped in a gray cotton cloth, tied with thick string. No note, no return address. I took it inside with trembling hands, my heart racing in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I opened it carefully. It was an old tape recorder. Small. One of those tape recorders. It had a label stuck on it with writing I didn't recognize. Or maybe I did, but wanted to deny it. Just 2 handwritten words. For you. I pressed the button, and the song began. The same. Note by note. Towards by towards. But now she came with another voice. A firmer, more mature voice. A voice conscious. Who didn't whisper in delirium but sang with intention. Like someone who remembers. Like someone who understands. Like someone who surrenders. It was him. I knew it instantly. I didn't need to see it. I didn't need to hear the name. It was the way he said, "Star." The way he breathed between lines. The way he held the pauses with a delicacy only those who have been between life and death know. I sat on the living room floor. I leaned my back against the bookshelf and let the music wash over me. It was the end and the beginning of everything. It was the most profound answer I would ever receive. And that was enough. There, on that silent morning, I realized he'd never disappeared, that his story hadn't ended at the port. He'd simply taken another path. A path made of waiting, of recognition, of an affection that doesn't need a presence to be real. And the strangest thing, or the most beautiful thing, is that when the song ended, a part of me calmed down. As if I could finally rest. As if time, that old traitor, had returned just to give me back the certainty that not all is lost, not everything that went away, really went away. Today, when silence fills the house, it's no longer emptiness that I hear. It's an echo, a faint, almost imperceptible echo of a song that crossed wars, seas, and decades to reach this place. Sometimes it comes on the wind that passes through the pines, sometimes on the floorboards that creak at night. But mostly, it comes from within, from a place inside me that never healed, but also never wanted to heal. Some secrets aren't meant to be revealed. They're meant to be kept like embers, burning slowly but warming silently. He wasn't on the list. Never was. But that didn't stop him from marking my name in places no one else had written. And perhaps that's what remains. This certainty without proof, this affection without origin, this love that didn't fit into logic, but found a place within me where it could exist without being judged. I let him go, because I loved him. And he came back, not with his body but with his voice, because he loved him too, even if we never said it with words. His memory lives on in small gestures. When I light the lamp for no reason, when I caress the copper button hanging in the reliquary, when I close my eyes and still smell the ether mixed with mint, and above all, it lives on in the way I hear my own name today, with that slow, drawling accent, as if it were a name invented by someone who knew me before I was even born. Maybe it's madness, maybe it's faith, or maybe it's just time's way of bringing me back to myself. If this story found some wound in you, if some part of it touched a void that no one understands, then maybe we are healing together, even without knowing it. Comment here, or just listen. That's enough. Here, we keep what didn't fit in the world, and it turns into shared silence.